We're joined live by NATO's Secretary General, Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Thank you very much for joining us here on RT. It's much appreciated. I want to get straight to our first question. The UK and France want a UN Security Council resolution condemning the Syrian government. In your opinion, are we heading for Libya 2.0 here?
No, I would like to stress that NATO has no intention whatsoever to intervene in Syria.
At the same time, lots of critics expect that that could be the case if we see a resolution, Russia saying that the fact that it's even being debated is going to cause more violence in Syria. There might be some kind of intervention. Do you think not? If the UN goes ahead and approves that resolution.
Once again, let me stress, we have no intention to intervene in Syria. Having said that, I share the international condemnation of the brutal attacks against the civilian population in Syria. The only way forward is to accommodate the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people.
Let's look at the lack of an entry strategy into Libya. It could be said that you were dragged into this, rushing to regime change. Have you accidentally gone to war in Libya?
Definitely not. On the contrary, we considered this very carefully. We laid out certain conditions that should be fulfilled before we took action, and the decisive factor was that the United Nations Security Council,
correct me if I'm wrong, but the UN resolution was laid out for a no-fly zone, and lots of people would consider what's happening in Libya to be much more than a no-fly zone.
Actually, the UN Security Council resolution goes beyond a no-fly zone. According to the UN Security Council resolution, we are mandated to protect the civilian population in Libya, taking all necessary measures. And that's exactly what we're doing right now.
Now, all necessary measures, if I might speak of what Admiral Di Paolo has legitimized strikes on any command center in Libya. I just want to clarify for some of our viewers who have seen homes bombed, they've seen civilian buildings blown to pieces. Does Gaddafi in a car on a phone or in a hospital on a phone constitute a command center for your purposes when you say any means?
I would like to stress that we are not targeting individuals. We hit legitimate military targets. And of course, command and control centers can be used to plan and organize attacks against civilians. So command and control centers are legitimate military targets.
With that said, I'd like to read a question to you that was written to us by one of our viewers on Facebook. Olivier Binji, who's from Paris, France, wants to know why NATO is bombing metropolitan areas in Libya and civilians are being killed. What do you say to Olivier?
We do all we can to avoid civilian casualties. We are in Libya to protect civilians against attacks, and this is the reason why our commanders are very, very careful in identifying legitimate military targets.
The G8 has asked Russia to mediate in Libya. They sent an envoy, and as Mikhail Margelev arrived, intensified bombing of Libya began. Why is that?
There's no link between the two events. We appreciate all attempts to find a political solution to the crisis in Libya, because obviously there is no military solution solely. We need a political process. Having said that, I still think that a strong military pressure on the Gaddafi regime will facilitate a fruitful political process.
Mr. Margelev yesterday, in fact, stated, and you just mentioning that military conflict doesn't have to be the means, that it could be resolved peacefully. He's stating that he believes that both the rebels and the regime forces are ready to negotiate, that they both think that war is not the way out of this conflict. So why are you still bombing Libya with this information coming from the Russian envoy that both sides are ready to talk?
We are continuing our operation because we still see the Gaddafi regime attacking its own population, and it's absolutely outrageous. And the UN has mandated an operation to protect civilians, and we will continue our operation as long as the regime still attacks its own people.
You met with Russian Defense Minister Serdukov yesterday, and he believes that troops on the ground in Libya are now a possibility. Do you think there will be troops under your command in the future?
We have no intention to put troops on the ground in Libya.
What if Gaddafi doesn't back down?
Well, I do believe that the combination of a strong military pressure and a reinforced political pressure will eventually lead to the collapse of the regime. It may happen tomorrow, it may take some weeks, but we will stay committed until we have fulfilled three very clear military objectives. Firstly, a complete end to all attacks against civilians. Secondly, a withdrawal of Gaddafi military forces and paramilitary forces to their barracks. And thirdly, immediate and unhindered humanitarian access to people in need. So we will continue our operation until these objectives are met.
Talk of post-war Libya seems premature, doesn't it, given William Hague and him stating that NATO, as he sees it, will be there until after Christmas. This, of course, all despite a 90-day deadline. When do you think you'll leave the Libyan people at peace?
Well, I'm not going to guess about any time frame. What I can say is that we are prepared to stay committed as long as it takes to fully implement the UN mandate, and that is to protect the civilian population against any attack.
What about the civilians that are being attacked in Syria, in Yemen, in Bahrain?
Yeah, of course, that's a legitimate question. The difference is that in Libya, we are operating on the basis of a UN mandate and with strong support from countries in the region. Actually, a number of countries in the region contribute actively to our operations. For these reasons, we are in Libya.
What do you say to critics who aren't convinced that NATO's end goal is to protect civilians and that, in fact, is a regime change?
We have been very open about our military objectives, a complete end to attacks against civilians, withdrawal of Gaddafi forces, and humanitarian access. These are our military objectives, and we will continue until they are met. In parallel, there is a political track defined by the international community. Recently, the G8 group, including the Russian president, called on Gaddafi to leave power. These two tracks are separate, a military track and a political track. But having said that, I think it's hard to imagine a complete end to attacks against civilians in Libya as long as Gaddafi remains in power.
I'd like to move on to missile defense in Europe, if I may. Defense Minister Serdukov also said yesterday that he's been largely ignored by you in your plans for AMD over Europe. Of course, you wouldn't accept that, but the facts, they certainly at this stage speak for themselves, don't they?
No, Russia is definitely not ignored. On the contrary, we have invited Russia to cooperate on missile defense. The fact is that NATO has decided to develop a NATO-based missile defense system because we want to protect our populations against missile attacks.
From who?
But we would also like to cooperate with
Mr.
Russia
Secretary
because we
General,
think we are faced with
missile attacks from who? From Russia?
We are faced with a common threat, and this is a reason why we would like to see two independent missile defense systems, a Russian system and a NATO system, cooperate, for instance, by exchanging data. The whole system would become much more effective that way to the benefit of the Russian population and population in NATO countries.
You do understand that it sounds a little bit of a contradiction there. You talk about joint trust, about a mutual threat, and then about separate systems. Why wouldn't one system between NATO and Russia be acceptable to protect both sides from any kind of threat?
Because I don't think at the end of the day that the Russian government and the Russian people would accept to be subject to a common command. I think the Russian nation as such would insist on having control of its own missile defense system. This is a reason why the most realistic approach would be to have two independent systems, but with a common purpose.
But
the common purpose is protection of our populations.
For years now, Mr. Rasmussen has been proposing a joint European defense system.
I'm just anxious to attend the table.
And I think the best way to join efforts would be to let two independent systems cooperate with the aim to protect the Russian people as well as people in NATO countries.
Russia constantly claims that NATO can't guarantee that its interests will be protected. Why can't NATO issue these guarantees?
The best guarantee whatsoever would be to engage in close cooperation, because close cooperation between Russia and NATO would clearly demonstrate that our missile defense is really a defense and it's not aimed at Russia. Let's face it, we do not consider Russia a threat to NATO, and NATO does not constitute a threat to Russia. So let's join efforts, let us cooperate.
But Russia sees it as they can't go forward on promises. Why can't you guarantee Russia on paper that a missile defense system would not be directed towards them?
Yeah, but it's very easy to guarantee because we don't have any intention to attack Russia, not whatsoever. But the best guarantee Russia could get would be to engage in a close cooperation and, for instance, establish a joint center where we could exchange data. That would clearly demonstrate that this system is not aimed at Russia.
All right. Well, Mr. Rasmussen, the facts might demonstrate otherwise. Thank you very much for taking the time out to be live with us from Brussels. It's very much appreciated. Hope to see you again.